Welcome back. We're discussing Taiwan's warmer ties with China and the impact that this has had on the United States and the region. I'm joined in Washington today by Dr. Bob Yang, president of the Formosan Association for Public Affairs, a DC-based advocacy group promoting Taiwan's right to full independence. Also with me today is Bonnie Glaser, a senior fellow for the CSIS Freeman Chair in China Studies, who also consults for the U.S. government on East Asia. Now, as we get back to our questions here, one question for you, actually, Dr. Yang. It seemed that China at least was willing to have Taipei appear at the World Health Assembly earlier this year as Chinese Taipei, to actually come as an observer, if nothing else. But it's still a positive step, surely.
The fact in itself is positive. However, I think one needs to look below the surface. There is a memorandum of understanding between WHO and China. And in that memorandum of understanding, for Taiwan to be a part of WHO, for that matter, all other UN-associated organizations, Taiwan basically has to admit that it is a part of China. Everything has to go through China. So the fact that Taiwan got in this year at WHA was because of China's goodwill, or at the mercy of China, so to speak. Okay. So the act itself is okay, but it's going to end up affecting Taiwan's de facto sovereignty and independence.
On the issue of economics, Bonnie Glaser, you're not so convinced about the economic interaction or dynamic between the two countries. What do you feel is the issue with that?
Well, Taiwan is in danger of becoming very isolated as the process of regional economic integration proceeds. We have seen already 60 free trade agreements signed in the Asia-Pacific region. Taiwan is not party to any of them. And as these free trade agreements come into effect and tariffs are lowered in trade between other countries, Taiwan's exports will suffer. And so what Taiwan needs to do is to get involved in this regional economic integration process. And the plan of Taiwan's President Ma Ying-jeou is to first sign a bilateral, what he calls an economic cooperation framework agreement with the mainland, and then he hopes that following that, he will be able to then open up free trade agreement type negotiations with other countries in the region. Now, Taiwan is already a member of the World Trade Organization, and as a WTO member, should be able to sign FTAs with any country in the world because it is an economic entity that as a member of the WTO, not as a sovereign entity. And so in the future, we may see that Taiwan has the ability to expand its trade agreements with other countries.
What do you make of the fact that for the first time in 17 years, Taiwan hasn't pursued UN membership? It's unusual for this to take this step, not to have pushed for its position at the seat at the UN.
President Ma Ying-jeou has adopted a more pragmatic and flexible approach, trying to enhance Taiwan's meaningful participation in UN-affiliated organizations. So he has called for Taiwan to now join under the UN, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and the UN Convention on Climate Change. And his government is working very hard to do that. Of course, as long as Beijing's opposition exists, that will be difficult. But this is a step-by-step approach. First, there was the World Health Assembly observership, and UN-affiliated agencies, and Taiwan's enhanced participation in those will follow. 17 years of bidding to join the UN have yielded no fruit whatsoever.
Dr. Yang, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, the rub about the economic cooperation framework agreement is that this de facto FTA has to be established with China first before Taiwan can do FTAs with other organizations or other countries. Why? I think the U.S. can play a leading role by allowing Taiwan to diversify its economy. So the U.S. of A. can lead the world by establishing an FTA with Taiwan. Then other countries will follow. And that way Taiwan will not depend on China for its economic growth. And the isolation of Taiwan can then be minimized. So I think the US of A can play a very critical role by relooking at the FTA that was already being considered in the US Congress before.
Interesting you raised this issue. We had an email from a viewer in Pakistan, and if I could put this to you, Ms. Glazer. It's from Riz Khan, who says, as China and the US work together for the prosperity of their nations, third world countries are getting nothing. We can criticize American policies now, but when China rises as a superpower, it will be the same. Do you come across a lot of the cynicism that China's, same as the West, out for its own interest and everyone else can basically be pushed aside?
Well, I think that China's presence, for example, in parts of the third world is a mixed bag. There are, just last week, there was a major meeting in Egypt on cooperation between China and Africa. And China will be donating, again, this is the second meeting, a very large amount of money to African countries. And some of that money goes to infrastructure projects and building of medical clinics, which I think is very helpful for developing countries. And then there are other ways in which China invests that is less helpful. The Chinese tend to bring their own labor force, for example, rather than hiring locals. Sometimes they dump very cheap products, and they do at times have their own selfish interests in mind when they invest abroad. So I think it's a very mixed picture, but I would say that it is the job of the international community to try and signal China when it is acting in a way that is really not in other countries' interests, and to try and promote them on a positive path. It is the countries that are recipients of aid and assistance from the developed world that also share the responsibility to ensure that they are using that kind of assistance in an effective manner.
Actually, it's an interesting thought, Dr. Yang, about how the young generation sees things. I mean, is the goal of independence for Taiwan, does it resonate with the younger generation?
Yeah, there have been some polls conducted, some of them pretty recently. And in Taiwan, only 4% of the people consider themselves Chinese. 53% of the people consider themselves Taiwanese. So Taiwan is separate and distinct from China. Now, some 68% of the people surveyed said that there will be no need for Taiwan and China to become one and the same country. And only 30+% would say that would be a good thing. So when we talk about Taiwan as a sovereign and independent country, separate and distinct from China, that reflects the wishes of the Taiwanese people.
The vast majority of the Taiwanese people consistently in polls support the status quo. They do not want to be forced to make a choice today. And if they could choose to be independent today without any consequences, if they could be assured there would be no attack from China, I have no doubt that the majority would choose to be independent. But Taiwanese are pragmatic people. They understand that there is that danger, and so the vast majority really support the status quo.
Well, 30 seconds to go, Dr. Yang. Do you think the same system that China has with, say, Hong Kong, the one country, two system?
I was just going to bring this up. You know, the rise of China as a superpower is different from the USA as a superpower. China is an authoritarian communist state. The USA is a free and democratic country. Taiwan and the USA share some common values, universal values, freedom, democracy, and human rights. Let's keep that in mind. That's not in the core of China's values.
Well, there, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank you both for taking part and for joining us in this debate. Hope we get a chance to revisit it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Remember, you can follow our program on Twitter. We'll keep you notified of upcoming shows, and you can send us questions and comments to pose to our guests. On the next show, with Muslims trying to establish independent states in Thailand and the Philippines and fears of the Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, should Washington be worried about the rise of Islamic movements in Southeast Asia? We speak with Republican Senator Christopher Bond, the Vice Chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Make sure you can tune in for that and send in your questions. But for now, from me and the team, we'll see you next time.